but there's certainly no justification for war if it's aggressive, you know? So we're back to my statement earlier that the proper function of coercion is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens, not to go forth and to make sure that they have democracy in their government or that they do certain things, that they share their oil or that, you know, whatever else. No. Then the kind of wars that we're dealing with in the world today are not defensive wars. They're aggressive wars. So I have always said I'm not against war per se. If it's defensive, I think we should be willing to defend our country.
Give me a good example of that real quick, Ed. Do you have one? I'm thinking of General Smedley Butler when he said war is a racket. I would have a hard time coming up with an authentic war that needed to be fought other than perhaps the Revolutionary War.
Well, I think there's an example. And after we got the nation founded, we sort of gave up that principle that war is a defensive enterprise and started to turn it into offensive enterprises to spread our influence and our economic power around the world. So we abandoned that principle of defense. Once we did that, we were on the slippery slope of abandoning our freedoms as well.
Yeah. You can't tell me that we got to go bomb Yemen and yet our borders and ports are still wide open. I have a really hard time with that. And the problem I have is that I use common sense, Ed. That's my disease.
Yes, not very common, though.
Well, I'm going to try to be pessimistically optimistic on that. One of the things I wanted to ask you about before we get you out of here, I'm looking at the whole health care, I call it health care perestroika, because that's what it reminds me of. That's reform, right, Ed? Perestroika.
Yeah.
And this is exactly this whole financial mess, the financial 9/11, I call it, which I think was an inside job. That's easy to prove. Was predicted by people like Gorbachev in the past, and this is how they were going to socialize America and then create this one world order. And I look at this health care thing, and it really has a lot of similarities to the Federal Reserve Act. They've got two similar plans, which they sell as different plans, alternatives, the public option and the single payer. That seems to be the debate with most people. They are what I call opposames. And much the same thing happened to get the Federal Reserve Act through. They had to nationalize the bank on one side and then the Federal Reserve on the other. When in reality they were really the same thing. And the people kind of caught in the middle didn't maybe understand some of these more complex financial issues, and you had Mr. Warburg out explaining it to everybody. When I think, you know, and maybe you would agree, maybe you wouldn't, I think that to legalize freedom, we have to have localization of banks, not nationalization, not international. I mean, the farther we can decentralize these banks, the more they could serve the community in a non-interest lending way so that they can sustain the community and the money can stay in the community. I think the more freedom we have. Is that in your mind, a potential viable option to the system we have now?
Well, Jack, I have a kind of mixed emotions on that. First of all, I am definitely in favor of localized government. I think that the smaller the governmental unit, the closer the politicians are to the people, the more chance we have of having a free society. And I think that tends to work also in the field of economics and commerce. Although now we're up against another issue, is that should we prohibit banks or should we prohibit grocery stores or automobile manufacturers or any other commercial enterprise? Should we prohibit them from operating nationally or internationally? And I don't think we should, because now that's not the defense of life, liberty, or property. We've overstepped our bounds. I think we should.
Well, I'm not talking about businesses. I'm talking specifically about money-lending institutions. And if there was a bad money-lending institution in my city, then wouldn't that open up in the free market the opportunity for somebody else to do a better job?
Well, of course. And I was gradually getting to that point that I don't think we have to regulate banks in any fashion that we don't regulate any other business. In other words, the only basis I believe that the state has for regulating a business is to make sure that they keep their contracts, that they keep their word, that they don't steal people's property, steal their money, and that they do what they say. I don't see why the bank should be singled out any more than a grocery store, you know? So, if a bank does something wrong, if it loses its money, if it goes out of business, it should fail, like a grocery store would fail. And then somebody else would come along with a better bank or a better grocery store, pick up the slack. So
I
think the problem is when we start to deal with banks as though there's some kind of a mystical thing that, that they have to be treated differently. And then we start to have a certain governmental provisions that will protect the banks, and we regulate the banks, and all of a sudden the banks and the government become the same. And that's one of the problems we have right now.
I think of the building and loan and It's a Wonderful Life and how the money from the community, goes to people who need to borrow it and how that stays in the community. And that's kind of, where I was coming. And I think in a way we agree. I mean, I think the only regulation, Ed, needs to be an educated populace voting with their dollars. And then we see the free market actually working. And the people that are unethical will be punished.
Exactly. If they don't keep their contracts with the depositors or the customers, they should be punished because they're stealing our property.
There are over 4,000 non-member banks. The membership, of course, to the Federal Reserve. They are being exterminated right now as we're talking. Is that a way out at all? Backing these people, putting your money into banks that aren't members of the Federal Reserve?
I'm not aware of any banks that aren't totally regulated by the federal government.
Well, I'm not talking about regulation, and of course we need to remember that the Federal Reserve isn't federal or has no reserves. But I mean, there are allegedly, over 4,000. I mean, this number is dwindling down, kind of like the family farm, on a daily basis. And it seems to me that the crisis and the first solution to the crisis was to centralize and to absorb these offending banks, which are the ones, I think, if we look at the statistics, Ed, these are the people that are being closed down on a regular basis and not bailed out.
Yeah, that's right. They're the smaller banks, and they're anathema to the big banks. They've always wanted to get rid of them. So this is the golden opportunity to do that. But I think what we need, Jack, is a separation of banks and state.
Forget the separation of church and state. We need that too, but separation of banks and state.
Yeah,
man, you couldn't have said that better. How do we do that?
Well, we start with the public awareness of the need for it. I mean, right now, most people think that banking is some kind of a mysterious, if not almost a religious institution. And, we need government in there, they think. So that we start with educating the people and getting them to realize that banks are no different than any other business.
It's been working pretty good so far, and I think 2009 was a good example of that. Ed, stay with me for just a few more minutes. We'll get you right out of here. I got about 2 more questions for you, and I kind of want to, if you can get a handle on predictions of what might happen here in 2010. I know my listeners would love to hear it. G. Edward Griffin with us, freedomforceinternational.org.